Stream to YouTube. Yes. Got it. And got it. Okay, I think that might work. All right, so welcome everyone to the inaugural Water, Wetlands and Watershed Seminar of Fall 2023. It is our great honor. Well, this whole semester we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Center for Wetlands. So you're going to hear from speakers from across the years that have worked with or around wetlands and specifically have worked with the scholars and researchers at the Center for Wetlands over the years. And our first speaker this semester is Kathy Ewell. So Dr. Ewell graduated in zoology from Cornell University and got her PhD here at the University of Florida. When she was an instructor up in Duke University, she sat in on Howard Odum's systems ecology course and the first sort of computer modeling of ecosystems. So this was
1970.
Yeah, 1970. So they were modeling ecosystems on computers that, you know, you recognize from TV shows and movies and things like that. Right? It's the case.
They were big in that.
And they started to learn some really amazing things about how ecosystems work by applying by applying computer science and systems ecology, how all things are connected. After moving back to UF, she worked with Howard Odum on the use of wetlands for wastewater treatment. And that project led to the founding of the Center for Wetlands here where you are. After 17 years, she moved to Hawaii to lead a USDA Forest Service team working on forested wetlands and including a lot of mangroves, I think we'll hear about today. She was awarded Professor of the Year in UF's College of Agriculture, and she received the Forest Service Chief's Award for Multicultural Organization and was elected President and later Fellow of the Society of Wetland Scientists. And just recently in 2022, she was awarded the Stephen C. O'Connell Distinguished Service Award. So we're very proud, we're very happy and honored to have you here as giving our seminar. Let's see if I can figure out how to do so. And why? Okay, good. That means YouTube is working and we will share this.
Yeah.
And then I will let those people into the room, admit them. Okay. I'll take care of this from my seat in a second. Close that and you should be good to go. Thank you,
Okay,
Kathy.
great.
You want this for clicking?
Thanks very much, Dave. Well, it's my pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to do today is two things. I'd like, first of all, to pay homage to the Center for Wetlands and HT Odum, since both of these institutions had very important influence on the trajectory of my career. So I got a dissertation, I did a dissertation in the University of Florida from the Department of Zoology, working on pocket gophers, and you can see the charismatic
Very cute. Yes.
lives underground for most of its life cycle. And so when I finished everything but writing, I applied for a job at Duke, and I was an instructor, and I was working with a bright, enthusiastic young assistant professor, Steve Vogel, who was very interested in finding better and more inspiring ways to teach introductory biology. And so we were structuring the labs to be built around models. So for instance, we had a lab on water where we looked at the structure of the water model to see how the water molecule, to see how water can be used or not used by different kinds of organisms. Now the reason I applied to Duke for a job was that my husband, Jack, was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which is just down the road from Duke. And he had been telling me, and HT Odum was his major professor, and he had been telling me all these things about HT and his approaches and concepts and so forth. So that first semester, I drove over twice a week and sat in on the systems ecology course. And so one of the things he did early on was he took some, like a light bulb, an energy source, and some capacitors and resistors and put them together, and bingo, he had a predator-prey model. And so I thought, aha. And so I came back to Steve and we built that into a laboratory and had students playing with predator-prey models. And that's probably my first modeling experience that I've had, that I published. So at the end of the 2 years that I spent at Duke, Jack and I were both looking for jobs. It was during a recession, no jobs to be had. Some of them would be advertised and then taken down. And so the best opportunity looked to be for Jack to come back to the University of Florida, Department of Botany, where he got his master's degree as an assistant professor. And so that worked out well for him. I wasn't so happy because I was going to be a stranded spouse. There were no spousal accommodations in those days. In fact, I was told that I should be grateful that my family had one job. So I was concerned about what it was going to be like, but fortunately things fell into place pretty quickly. Ariel Lugo was also was the other ecology faculty member in botany at that time. He had a project on mixed hardwood forests, and so he gave me a 1/3 time postdoc to help him do nutrient cycles. Well, sounded great. I guess I'd had a plant physiology course, but I learned pretty quickly about nutrient cycles. This is a stem flow collar put around a tree to capture the water that comes down the tree, so you can then analyze it and add that into your nutrient cycle. So that was interesting. But the other thing that was fortuitous is that H.T. Odum, the previous year, had actually moved from Chapel Hill back to Florida. And so he'd been there for a year, so he had a whole cadre of graduate students and postdocs. And so here I was with this, I'd just been hooked on models. So here I was starting to do models, and I had all of these friends who could help in various ways, including Odum himself. So I worked on a number of different kinds of things. I looked at the impact of land use activity in a watershed on the sediment accumulation rate in a reservoir where a dam was being built in the Dominican Republic. And I did this on the big analog computer and nuclear engineering. And I also did a few models on aquatic weed control, and the Corps of Engineers came to me and asked me to do a study under contract of the impact of the grass carp, which is this fine-looking fish. It's an Asian fish. The impact of introducing grass carp for aquatic weed control in a Florida lake. And so that got me a new title, assistant research scientist. And I was well on my way at that point in modeling. And I had a sense of security at that point because I felt if there was no job for me at the university, then I could go into consulting of some sort. So the other thing that happened is that in 1973, the National Science Foundation Research Applied to National Needs program and the Rockefeller Foundation gave big grants to H.T. Odum to look at the impact of secondarily treated wastewater on a forested wetland, a cypress swamp. This was just after the Clean Water Act was passed, and the nation was very upset about the level of pollution in the lakes and streams across the country. And so Odum's idea was, why not put this sewage into a wetland where it's used to being a wetland and let the trees and the sediments help take up the nutrients and store the nutrients. So it was a big grant. It involved several other scientists, both at the university and elsewhere. So he gave me, when that came through, he gave me a half-time postdoc on that project. And I did some research. I helped graduate students with their research. I helped write papers, summary papers and things like that. And in the next funding cycle, I was co-principal investigator. And so after that, there were a couple of grants from the Environmental Protection Agency, small grants from local regional organizations. And we worked together until 1982. And it worked out very, very well. We had a very symbiotic relationship. But at that point, he was branching off more into policy issues, and of course, working on his energy concept. And I was getting deeper into forested wetland ecology and keeping up with modeling. So we had a fine collegial relationship after that. of course, the Center for Wetlands was started with that grant. I had an office here, just down the hall that isn't here anymore. And I was rubbing elbows with soil scientists, biogeochemists, geologists, hydrologists. And so I was really learning a lot, not only about cypress swamps, but also about ecosystems in general. And so eventually I did get a permanent position in the unit that's now known as Forest Fisheries and Geomatic Sciences as an ecosystem ecologist. And my teaching took advantage of my background in vertebrate biology and also my interest in modeling for graduate students. In doing research, I was doing most of my modeling really in pine plantations, but I was also doing a lot of field work in cypress swamp ecology and silviculture. So it looked like all's well that ends well, but it never ends sometime. And sure enough, in my career change, which I highly recommend, the U.S. Forest Service twisted our arms to come work for them in Honolulu, Hawaii, at their Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry. Jack was to be the director of the institute, and I was to be a mangrove ecologist. Why not? and became the forested wetlands team leader in pretty short order. The purview of the institute was the let's see, I want to do that. How do I go back?
You can just use the arrow on the keyboard, back arrow.
Oh, yeah, okay. The islands were now called the U.S. affiliated islands of Micronesia, which are mostly north of the equator. And also American Samoa down here. And these are these are very remote islands. I mean, it looks like they're all packed in there, but just cheek to jowl practically. But you have to remember that when Magellan sailed around the Cape Horn and on up here, he got all the way to Guam before he set eyes on land again. So they're very distant. Each one is pretty much its own country. And they were, once they were discovered, as it were, by Europeans and Asians, then explorers started to come, whalers came and brought with them ideas of colonization, claiming an island for Spain and so forth. And the diseases spread rapidly and decimated populations on a number of islands. In 1914, Japan held a League of Nations mandate over sort of a kind of a responsibility for many of these islands and many more, especially in Melanesia. And after World War II, the U.S. held a UN, United Nations trusteeship over the Micronesian area, which was called the Trust Territory. And so the idea of the Trust Territory was to provide funding to help the islanders increase their standards of education and health, and also to help them towards providing towards building a sustainable economy on their islands. Their political, their politics pretty much crystallized over the next couple decades. And three of the island group became independent republics. And that's the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and then Republic of Palau. I did most of my work in the Federated States of Micronesia and mostly on the island of Kosrae. And so when they became independent countries, then the U.S. established a compact of free association with these three republics. What we got out of it was permission to sail our nuclear submarines through their waters. What they got out of it was a designated source of funding specified to be used in specific ways to increase health, education, and so forth. And we would also defend them, if necessary. And so during the trust territory days, for instance, the Forest Service established forest inventory plots through many of these islands to look to the future towards perhaps using timber as a resource. So the island of Kosrae is where I did most of my research. It's a small island, 100 square kilometers, and very mountainous. You can see from the picture that it's pretty rugged terrain in the interior. And I have to say, this is looking from the south up, and so this is the same as this area here. In this bay, the ship of Bully Hayes the pirate was sunk. And he is said to have buried his treasure somewhere in Kosrae, and they're still looking for it. About 2/3 of the island is vegetated with mangroves. That's the green is all mangrove swamp. Most of the population lives on the northeast and southeast edge, and most of them live close to, sometimes right in back of mangroves, or a little bit upslope from there. It gets 4 meters of rain a year, which is a lot. No distinct dry season. And the population when I was working there was in the mid set of thousands, which is probably pre-contact, the same as it was pre-contact. So when I landed the first time on Kosrae, it was clear that there was a major resource management issue here, and that was that mangroves were being harvested extensively for firewood. It wasn't unusual to see clear cuts like this around the island. The two species in particular, which I'll talk a lot more about later, were cut for firewood. And in Kosrae's history, in the mid 1800s, their population was badly decimated by diseases. They lost the kingdom, they had a king and so forth, all of that was lost. And missionaries came out from the Congregational Church primarily, and they helped the islanders to rebuild a structure more like, of course, what you see in the US, more of a democracy. And so they're tremendously grateful, and the church remains really the central part of most of their social life. And so part of that is that you can't work on Sundays. And so you have to cook all your meals on Saturday, on Saturday for both Saturday and Sunday. And they do that by building an earthen oven and stoking it with firewood. So that's not too bad. 2 meals once a week, that's okay. And but if there's a funeral, then that oven could keep on going for days and sometimes even weeks for particularly important people. So that's when you get these huge clear cuts here. And we estimated a few years later that over the last 10 years, about 10% of the island of the mangrove estate had been harvested. So in the research that I did on Kosrae, I was trying to get away from just looking at mangroves as green slime. There's mangroves and there's mangroves. And it seemed to me, I liked the concept that Colin Woodruff put together of looking at them as being fringe mangroves, riverine mangroves, or interior mangroves, because not every single bit of forest is exactly like every other. So, and also it seemed as though something as simple was something that a land manager without a lot of education could figure out and be able to work with. So the fringe mangrove forest is just as it says, it's on the fringe of the forest, and it gets tides twice a day, full strength seawater, and so the water moves very quickly over the surface. It has the fewest tree species of any of the 3 types. It's kind of a harsh environment, but it does provide important stormwave protection, breaking the force of storm tides that come in before they get further on into the mangroves or into the human development, just in back of the mangroves. Riverine mangrove forests, these aren't exactly rivers, they're streams. but what we call them rivers. So it's very common in these mangroves, not all mangroves, for the river to come up and down the mountains and go through it. Now, of course, when the tide comes in, it comes in as a wedge and it lifts up the fresh water. And so the water that spills out over the banks is brackish, and that makes it more, the most productive mangroves usually occupy about a third to a half strength seawater. And so they provide a more productive environment. More nutrient flow also from the sediments coming downstream from the mountains. There's higher tree species richness, and again, these provide storm wave protection too, because the water that spreads out during that flood time can move pretty quickly over the forest floor. The interior mangroves are not completely flooded by every tide, and in places that have a very just have any kind of a dry season, the seawater will come in and the water evaporates, the salt stays, and these interior forests are usually not very productive, but they often have salinities well over sea strength. In Kosrae, that's not the case. These are certainly the most benign of the three environments. And they also have the lower salinity because of the groundwater flow in several places that comes down from the mountains and into the forest. And they have the highest tree species richness. So you can see that there are differences to each of these, and you can usually take any forest and put it somewhere in that triangle to figure out what its resources are likely to be. So the basis for most of the research that I did there were plots that I established, and I used the same tree inventory plots that had been put in earlier throughout Micronesia, so that we could compare data on our trees with trees from these other sites. So we've got at each of four rivers, these are fairly undisturbed areas. We've got a fringe plot, a riverine plot, and an interior plot. And I'm not going to go into the details of how to do tree inventory, except to say that there are 5 points at which the inventory is done, and around each of these points are 4 randomly located seedling plots, 1 square meter in size. So when we did the inventory on these sites that I set up, we found that there were 3 species that were found in all 4 zones, and they were much more common than any of the others. The importance value is a very good general way of assessing what the most important species are. So Bruguiera generaliza is most important, and that's especially common in the riverine zone. Sonradia alba, very common in the fringe zone, and then Rhizophora particulata, common in the interior. This fellow standing here is Eric Walker. He was the Kosrae State Forester, and he was a participant in every project that we did, and he loved every minute of it. He liked learning new things. He liked to learn how to run equipment, and he was a very good natural historian, so he was a real asset to the whole project. He's standing next to a Rhizophora particulata, and you're probably familiar with the Rhizophora monglay that we have around Florida. It's the same thing with stilt roots, and those stilt roots, of course, help support the tree in these areas where you get rapid water movement. And they also have lenticels that help oxygen get down into the roots. Bruguiera generaliza has low buttresses, and they also have little knee roots that are very much like Nyssa sylvatica in our black gum, swamp black gum. Sonradia alba is a spectacular tree. When it's open grown like this, it's just massive. And you can see that it's got lots of epiphytes growing off of the branches. Birds fly in and out all day long. Fruit bats nest in there. It's really a very, very significant tree in a lot of ways. The woman standing at the bottom is Zuleika Pinzon. She was a graduate student of Jack Quitz's from University of Florida, and she came out, I guess, about a year after I started, and she did a master's degree looking at the effect of the large gaps and small light gaps, regular normal light gaps on seedling distribution. And what she found is that Bruguiera and Rhizophora are by far the most common seedlings. She felt as though Bruguiera might be outcompeting Rhizophora, but it was, to me, that study was sort of the inspiration for what I'm now going to talk about, because it gave us some way of looking at sort of the background habitat of these most important species to get some sense of how they affect others. So just to talk about seedlings, this is Tom Smith, who's with the U.S. Geological Survey, and he's holding a Rhizophora stem here, and you can see that there are little fruits sort of pendant down from underneath the leaves, and here is a fruit that has actually germinated and starting to grow. And so it's not a seedling yet because it's still hanging on the tree, and it's not a seed because the seed has germinated. So these propagules float and they can be carried with the tides. They're dispersed very, very readily, and they can go for very long distances. Hawaii is which is the most remote archipelago on Earth, never got mangroves, but virtually every other island with the suitable mud flats and so forth around it didn't get mangrove propagules from one place to another. And that's not all mangroves that have this kind of reproduction. So then when the propagule does lodge, like in a mud flat, you can see the little rootlet coming out here. And so it puts out these roots and, whoops. Okay. It puts out the roots and it grows up into seedlings. And so what we did with these seedling plots was we came every year, we tagged every seedling that came up in that plot. We put a tag on it and we measured it every year, and we noted if it was dead or no longer there or whatever. And so that was going to give us estimates of establishment and mortality. But I could tell that we weren't going to get an awful lot of measurements. And so we selected haphazardly up to 5 additional Brugieras and 5 additional Rhizopteras in the surrounding area. And those we did the same thing too. We tagged them and measured them. And we used those mostly for estimates of growth and survival. So that's what it looks like when it's what we call established as a seedling. And it's about 50 centimeters high. And you can see them, they often come several together like that. And we ended up tagging and measuring 1,749 seedlings over an 8-year period. And I have to tell you, when you start reading about seedlings and mangroves, people studied seedlings for 2 years, maybe 3 years, and then they died, or the grant ran out or something. And there's just nothing to indicate what happens over that period of time. And that's one of the things that attracted me, knowing that I didn't know how long we would be working in Hawaii. At first, I mean, we got leaves of absence. We thought we'd go back after 2 years. No way. The seedlings, sure enough, they didn't land where we thought they'd be. The Bruguiera, which was more common in riverine, more important in riverine, we had many more seedlings in the interior. Rhizophora, which was more important in interior, the seeds were more common in riverine. And then we actually did get 6 seedlings of Soneradia. Now, Soneradia has a fruit that's more like a berry. And so it does spread easily, but it just has a very different pattern. And we hardly got anything else, as you can see, 6 other species over that time. So we're really looking at the mangrove estate. There's 13 or 14 species in all, but really right now, it's Bruguiera and Rhizophora that are the ones to think about. So we looked at the growth rates and they're slow. The 80% of the growth rates that we measured were less than 15 centimeters per year. Bruguiera's growth rates were faster than Rhizophora's, and in the interior, I think the fastest growth rate was something like 65 centimeters per year in 1 year. The Rhizophora, they were mostly about the 25 to 30 range when they're the fastest that we see, and there's really not much difference among the 3 zones. And Bruguiera, the fastest growth rates were in the interior. But the interesting thing is that we looked at the seedlings for which we had at least 5 years of measurement, and they would just sit there. They would grow and just sit there. And so you're thinking, well, these things aren't growing. Well, duh. They're growing branches and they're growing roots. And so you'll just see these vast rafts of them seemingly doing nothing. And so and this is true of both of them, that they'll stop around 150 centimeters, and then they'll get going again, maybe up to less than 200, and then finally, there are a few that did what we call graduated. If they did 2 meters, then we stopped measuring. But there's just very little movement, very little growth from year to year. It's just every now and then something picks up and goes, and we don't know exactly why. Survival of Rhizophora is generally, this is looking at probability of survival over based on the height. And Rhizophora survival seems to stabilize at a smaller size than Bruguiera. And Bruguiera especially did not do very well in the fringe zone. You can see that it lags here in the riverine as well. But overall annual mortality of these seedlings is 36%. And so that's why I'm thinking of people who studied seedlings for 2 or 3 years, they just died.
Not the people that did.
Right.
We want to make sure about that.
They died of anxiety.
Their PhD.
So this is a fringe forest, and this is Soneradia. And what you see here are Soneradia seedlings and pneumatophores on the mud flat. And so, when the tides come in with dissolved sediments and not dissolved sediments, then the water moves through these things and they tend to settle. These seedlings and rhizophoras make the water slow down and sediments fall out. And so this is really a proto-fringe zone. And Soneradia is the pioneer for building the fringe zone. And when you look at the distribution, remember I showed you the importance values. It's very important in the fringe, and you've got some also in riverine and some in interior, and those are probably old fringe zones. And so you start to get a sense that things are happening over geologic time. And there's very deep mangrove peat underneath these forests, and it indicates that even with sea level rises and falls over the previous years, these mangroves have been there for a very long time.
Got about 10 minutes.
Okay. So the main messages were, first of all, that harvesting might be restricted to just the interior zone. The trees grow fast, and I should say that Rhizophora is harvested more commonly. It's people tend to prefer it more than Bruguiera, but they'll harvest both. And so one of the things I didn't put down there is maybe that they harvest some more Bruguiera instead. And so Bruguiera is more common than Rhizoptera, and it does grow a little faster. I didn't get any sense that there was competition, between them. And Rhizoptera survives as well as Bruguiera and sometimes better. And I think that the high mortality rate of these seedlings has very important implications for the soil accumulation rate, not just in that protozoan up front, but in the mangrove forest itself. So if H.T. Odum were in this room, he'd be looking at me and he'd say, "Where's the model?" Well, here's a model. What we did was really a population study. And so these are our establishment rates per hectare per year. This is our standing crop, the average number of seedlings. This is throughout all the plots. Very small graduation rate, moving up into saplings, and this isn't really into the canopy yet. And then this high mortality rate. And so one of the things that Odum always said is that in order to understand the system that you're working on, you really need to understand the system within which it's nested. And so what they need now out there is a young, energetic mangrove ecologist to do things like looking at biomass attached to the numbers of seedlings at different heights. It's the biomass of seedlings, not just the number. And also the rate at which these seedlings are building the root mat for their own stability, but also accumulating peat, which will give us a sense of how well these forests will face sea level rise. So I'd just like to mention my collaborators. Jim Baldwin was the Forest Service statistician who worked with me when I was working for the Forest Service. We both have retired for many years now, but we kept on working on this. It took 8 years to measure the seedlings. It took 8 years to do the paper. He was in California, and I live in Florida. He helps a lot of people like me. Tom Cole is the person who established the original tree inventory plots. He was involved in that effort, and he established our plots. And he was also my database manager when we were in Hawaii. And Eric Walcock, I mentioned before, is the Kosrae State Forester. Katie Friday was part of our team, the Forest and Wetlands team. And as we would finish a project, Katie would help us work out some kind of workshop or presentation or whatever to get information back into the community. And whenever we finished, we would go out to Kosrae and work with a couple of the Kosraeans and put together a presentation, and I would give it, or two Americans would give it, two Europeans would give it, and to the state legislature. And then we go to the marine science class at the high school, and the Kosraeans would give that presentation, and they would give it again while we were still there, and they would give it again somewhere else, and then they would keep giving it after we left. And so they were able to internalize the message pretty effectively. So that's it, and I thank you very much for coming.
All right, thank you, Dr. Yu. We'll start with questions in the room, and then if you're on YouTube or in Zoom, you can put a question in the chat, or you can unmute and ask your own question. So we'll start in the room.
You mentioned really deep peat underneath them. Did you ever core to see how deep?
People have cored.
Yeah.
There's a Japanese group that was working on the mangrove roots, doing a root analysis in Pohnpei. And then Ken Krause was a technician who worked with us for several years, and he went on to get a PhD and now works for USGS. And he has established sediment elevation plots that always includes cores that go far down. So we do have a fair amount of data.
So you know how, like, what's a guess on accumulation rates there relative to sea level rise, or?
Well, as it turns out, the accumulation rates are pretty moderate. there are a couple places we've been through El Niños and La Niñas. And things change then after both of those. But in general, they have been accumulating and slightly more than than sea level rise. And the rate of sea level rise is actually a little bit slower than for Kosrae and Micronesia than we had thought originally.
So the idea that they are slow growing and then are just kind of hanging, it reminds me, of course, of like longleaf pine here. And then there's some sort of release
Yes.
event or phenomenon. So do you have any clues on, I mean, clearly there are canopy and overstory trees, they must get there. You know, once they graduate, do you know, do they shoot up or they're still just slow the whole time?
No, once they'll have a spurt very often after they've been sitting there for a while. We have no idea what causes that spurt. And then there has to be another loss of saplings too, because that's still that number per hectare for the saplings is less than is much greater than the number of trees in the canopy.
Yeah.
So that's yet another mangrove ecologist to look at that one. Yeah.
Are the mature forests even age stand, or are they staggered in the sense of age? Not necessarily within the same species. I'm just curious, if you did have a hurricane impact or something like that, does that forest tend to wipe itself out and then reestablish, or is it just a staggered?
There's no, they don't get typhoons here. Typhoons get boring here and they move, but they do occasionally get a big storm. But they don't have that same impact that they have in many other places, certainly in the Caribbean and Florida. So you don't see that. There's really no natural rate. Lightning is very rare. In fact, Eric took me out once and showed me a place where there was a circle of trees that were dead. And he was just flummoxed, but it looked to me like lightning. And it, very often there are connections between the roots of these things, and you get one good lightning strike and it can kill more than one tree.
So they don't have rings, I don't think, right?
No, they really don't.
So it's hard to age those little trees.
Yeah. But we now, with the tree inventory data, we're getting a better sense for it. And the growth rates we do have on the mature trees match up to Southeast Asian trees. So it's a very good productivity rate.
So those massive trees are how old?
Who knows? Interesting thing. When we did the survey of how how much is being harvested, you can age the seedlings because as they go from one layer of leaves to the next, there are nodes in between, 4 to 5 nodes. And so Eric would take the guy who was doing it, Rob, to these different sites, and he might know who cut that site, but the guy wouldn't tell because he was afraid he'd get arrested. And so they just looked at what the seedlings were doing, and they figured out the age at which that site was likely to have been cleared. And so that was a big help for those early stages, but not so much for the early ones. So photography, very often aerial photography is a help in determining the rate at which the canopy fills up.
So do you have a question from Andre online? He asks how were the recommendations implemented and what was the impact on the forest?
Well, the Eric was in charge of implementing them. And I mean, all we can do is recommend. And they have their own ways of deciding what they want to do and what they don't want to do. And I don't know. Katie Friday is still out there, and she's sort of my eye on the island, and she tells me what generally things are doing. But they may not pass a law or anything like that, but they may let it get around, and that they should be doing this or doing that. And I have no idea how what the impact has been. But I have to say, Eric unfortunately passed away a few years ago and had a heart attack. It was very unfortunate. His daughter is now the Kosrae state forester. So she was educated in Japan. And And so, one hopes that, and Katie has very good relationships with all of these people, so one hopes that they're picking up on things.
Any last questions for Dr. Yule? All right, let's give another round of applause. Thank you so much. All right, so next week, our speaker is Dr. Kelly Reese, a graduate of the Center for Wetlands here. It will be a virtual seminar, but we will be in this room. So for our on-campus students, you are welcome to come or you're welcome to watch it live, but I still want to, if you're on campus, want your either your eyes or your person at the seminar, all right? And you should be able to find the assignment online. If you have any questions, email myself or Dr. Clark. Thank you very much.
Thank you.